Cuba's humanitarian crisis is getting worse by the day, with intensifying blackouts and skyrocketing food costs 1 month into the U.S.-imposed oil blockade. A 36-year-old named Reyden de Coro told the U.S.-based independent media organization, Belly of the Beast, quote, "The future is extremely uncertain, but something has to happen somehow because we're the ones suffering the most." Secretary of State Marco Rubio, the son of Cuban immigrants and a longtime advocate for regime change in Cuba, told Bloomberg that the U.S. will ease up its pressure campaign if Cuba opens its economy. Rubio wouldn't reveal really the end game here, though he said the Trump administration was willing to provide humanitarian aid. Mexico has gone ahead on some of that. 2 ships carrying aid docked in Cuba on Thursday. President Trump has claimed that talks with the Cuban government are underway. But according to 5 Cuban and American officials who spoke with Dropsite News, there are and have been no negotiations involving high-level officials between Havana and Washington. Joining us now to discuss all of this is Ted Henkin, Cuban Studies professor at Baruch College. Professor, it's great to have you on the show with us.
Wonderful to be here.
The first time. Okay, so I want to begin, I guess, with what's happening there on the ground, the impact of the oil blockade and the fuel shortage there, what we know about what life has become on the island.
Well, the context first is important, that Cuba has been in a bad way for decades, and especially since COVID. Its main drivers of its economy have evaporated. Tourism is dead in the water. People aren't going to Cuba. They're leaving Cuba. There's a massive immigration, right? And then all of their other kind of strategies to bring in money have also evaporated. They would send doctors around the world, around Latin America. A lot of the government's changed, and so that money is dried up. People aren't sending as much remittances. So they're already in a bad way. They have an unworkable economy. There's not very much incentive to do any work in Cuba because the government runs most of the country. Then you have teetering Venezuela, the end of Maduro, and the end of Venezuela's support of Cuba. So all the reports that I get from my contacts on the island and all the other contacts I have in the Cuban American community are that things are worse than ever. They're worse than they were during what was called the special period 20 or 30 years ago after the fall of the Soviet Union. And that means what? That means the main thing that is different this time is blackouts aren't just, let's say, 6 or 8 hours a day. They call them actually alumbrones because the light is on for less time than it is off. So it's strange that the lights come on, right? There's not enough fuel to get the food that might be coming into the ports or other things that might be coming into the ports to destinations throughout the island. And then there's just a general scarcity of medicine. People aren't going to their jobs because there's no fuel, and they've cut back on. They have a 4-day school week, so they're really in a bad way, and the people of Cuba are suffering tremendously, and that's on top of suffering that they've been enduring for decades.
So then what do you think the end game is here? Because as you point out, we've had sanctions on Cuba for decades. Cuban people have been suffering for decades. It's unlike in Venezuela, it's not clear to me who the designated successor would even be right now. So how do you interpret what the strategy is here? What presumably Marco Rubio, this seems to be his North Star, like what they are actually hoping will happen that will, if they punish the Cuban people just enough, then what happens?
Well, this is my fear, is that there's not really a clear strategy or an end game. It is more, we're going to hope they say uncle, and we're going to keep, tightening the screws until they do. We're going to play psychological games by claiming that there's negotiations when maybe there's not negotiations. We're going to send up trial balloons, like say, oh, we really care about human rights, or no, actually what we care about is economic opening, or no, what we care about is democratic opening. And so that seems to be the strategy. Also, there seems to be an ignorance of history, right? We invaded Cuba. We controlled Cuba's government before, and it ended very badly for Cuba. This was like 120 years ago, but people who study history know that Cuba's first independent government was hobbled because it was controlled by the United States that had a veto power over decisions that they would make. That led up to a resentment, a historic resentment that gave birth to the Cuban Revolution, The Cuban Revolution has long since become a Cuban dictatorship, but those lessons of history are required if you are the strongest country in the world with a military that just invaded or just took out the head of a foreign country, Maduro, and now are beating the drums that you may do something similar in Cuba. Cuba is very different in many ways, oppressive, undemocratic like Venezuela, but very different in terms of the power structure, in terms of the resources, and in terms of essentially the collapse of a functioning society. Venezuela, as bad as it was, had media that was oppositional. It has an opposition, right? And also the Cuban government has been very effective in repressing and then exiling the opposition. About 4 or 5 years ago, there was a coalescing opposition. But after the 2021 protests, the government threw more than 1,000 people into prison. And then there was this massive wave. More than 2 million people have left Cuba since then. The population has shrunk from 11 to 9 million. And so the opposition that could be relied on for a transition is abroad. And so it will be, one thing is to think about how we can, make them say uncle, how we can bring down an authoritarian regime. But then what do you build in its place?
Well, what's your sense of the factions among the public and where public opinion lies? I know it's an impossible question to answer, given that we're so limited on what we can know. But based on your contacts, is this making people dig in and be more loyal to the regime? Are they just sick of it, ready to go? There's so many different camps within the populace.
Well, for a long time, what the people think in Cuba hasn't mattered because it's not a democratic country. There's not a free press. There aren't the civil liberties that we enjoy in the United States and then we fight to defend in the United States. The problem is that I think people are so immiserated, so fed up with the regime that they have, that they actually, again, it's speculation, but I would say 70% of the population wants a change of regime. And it's really a kind of a reality show, the government's posturing of sending people out with rifles to defend, first of all, in a practical sense, but also the morale is get out of Cuba or survive, but not fight to defend what they believe, in the vast majority of cases, in my opinion and in my experience, is a dictatorship that represses them, even though many people probably are skeptical of what could come from foreign intervention, what could come from the Trump White House. I think that many people, this is done, and what comes can't be any worse.
I think that from the family members that I talk to, that rings very true. There is a small minority of people who are so tied in with the government and with the regime that they have too much to lose to shift course at this point, and I think we'll kind of go down swinging. But there is, at this point on the island, even a small population emerging there that has almost the Miami Cuban mindset. Actually, there's so much anger and restlessness over it. And that's something that's sort of unheard of. Like, to have the Miami posture, but living on the island was not really a thing for a long time, at least in my experience.
No, because you would go right to jail, you would be, interrogated, you would be threatened, or you would be sent into exile. But people have lost their fear. And that happened 5 years ago. The government quashed the rebellion, quashed the marches, and thought that they neutralized this. But the problem is that the system is built so that it creates the opposition again and again and again. There's this young group of people who basically set up their own YouTube channel. They're influencers. El Cuartico is the name of the group. And they have these brilliant, they started out unpolitical, but they got more and more critical of the government, more and more honest, more and more with a kind of Miami critical mindset. And they just got picked up about a week ago, and now they're being tried and sent to prison. But now there's a huge movement calling for their release, justice for El Cuartico. So it's a situation that's in many ways unprecedented, and there's not anywhere to turn. There's no Venezuela, Russia, China. They're not there to help out as they were in the past.
Ted Henkin, thank you.